one thing is that it's been noticed that there's a lot of shared material between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the similarity is too close to explain it in terms of just shared sort of memory. It's actual verbal similarities in terms of the sentences, and the way most scholars would explain that today is that Mark's Gospel was written first. And I think there is good evidence, actually, that Mark is the John Mark mentioned in the New Testament, who is a friend of the Apostle Peter. But that Mark's Gospel was written first, and then Matthew and Luke, writing a little bit later, both used Mark as a source. And I think it's important to say this is a good thing. It shows that Matthew and Luke were behaving in the way that historians would be expected to, and using good quality eyewitness sources that came before them. And so they've incorporated a significant amount of Mark's material into their Gospels. But you also notice that they have a lot of material that seems to be shared in common between them that's not in Mark, like the Sermon on the Mount, for example. And that some scholars would say, and this is a bit more debated, but some scholars would say there was a written source that came before Matthew and Luke that was more or less the sort of Jesus' greatest hits of his teaching. It's sometimes referred to as Q. Now, yeah, whether that was a source or not is a bit more debated, or whether, maybe it was Matthew wrote first and Luke had access to Matthew. That we can't really be too sure. But then Matthew and Luke also have a number of stories and sayings of Jesus that are just in their Gospels. So anyway, but the synoptic Gospels, as they're known, it is clear that there is some kind of relationship between them, but I don't think that should be something that's kind of troubling. It's not something that undermines their reliability. And actually, as I said, it shows that Matthew and Luke are behaving like historians, and actually they've been very conservative in their use of Mark. They've tidied up some of his rather kind of rough and ready Greek, and they've polished it a bit. So just to give you an example, Mark uses basically a slang term for a bed or a mattress that they carried the paralyzed man on in Mark 2, and Luke changes it to the nice posh word for bed. So there's things like that, and that's actually part of the evidence that Mark came first, because you wouldn't rough up the language; it would go in the other direction. But anyway. But then John people do notice John does seem to be different from the other three, and has much longer sections of Jesus talking. Again, I don't see that as a problem. Actually, the sayings of Jesus in the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels, are very compressed. And if you think about how long does it take to read the Sermon on the Mount, and, I don't know, a few minutes. But of course, Jesus wasn't just up there for 5 minutes giving the Sermon on the Mount. It would have gone on for much longer. So I think one very plausible possibility is that John has actually tried to record more of the flow of what it was like when Jesus, was in his element teaching, whereas the synoptics have gone for more the snappy, highly memorable, the pithy sayings. But yeah, and John, I think there is very good evidence that John's Gospel is rooted in the recollections of an eyewitness. Scholars have noted that John's references to the geography, the landmarks, is very, very detailed and accurate. So just to give you one example, the pool of Bethesda mentioned in John 5, you can go there. I went there about 3 years ago. It's in part of Jerusalem, and John's Gospel gives various details about it, that it's located by the sheep gate, that it had 5 porticos, and that there were certain disturbances in the water. And archaeologists found this pool in the 50s, and when they excavated it, all matched up, even down to the small details of the way the water would have flowed, would have created these disturbances. So again, this all suggests that that this is the kind of information that in a world without Google and Wikipedia, you can't get right unless you are there.
How can we be sure that they've not even been changed since then?
So I think there's a couple of quite distinct questions there. So one is, how do we date the original composition of the Gospels? And that isn't a totally straightforward issue. I think, you don't really have anyone saying that we can date the Gospels to a specific year. You're more talking about kind of brackets of time. So really no scholar would put any of the Gospels later than kind of 90 AD. And that's really because they are so rooted in first century Palestinian Judaism. Their knowledge of the world and the customs and what life was like in Jesus' actual time and place, which, you know, even 50 years later, things were very different because the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem completely in AD 70 and the way of life changed a lot. So that's why the Gospels really, no one would locate them kind of anywhere beyond the second half of the first century. And I think even, you know, there's a strong case for putting them in the middle of the first century in terms of their composition. But that doesn't answer your second question, which is to do with, okay, once they've been written, how do we know that the reproduction of those texts is faithful down the centuries? There's a whole discipline called textual criticism, which it's all about trying to trace the histories of manuscripts. And if you think of, you could think of it like a tree, basically, because you have the original text and then it gets copied and then the copies get copied. And we don't have the trunk of the tree, but we have lots of the branches at the ends. And so the reason actually that we can be so confident that the texts have stayed basically the same is that we've got lots of the branches and they match up really well. Now, of course, there are some variations, but I think that the key thing to say here is that there is no kind of cover up or conspiracy to sort of you know, brush this under the carpet. If you look in any good modern Bible translation, it will have footnotes so that anywhere where there is a variation that actually could impact on the meaning of the text, the scholars who put together these translations, like the New International Version, have been completely open about that fact. And what you'll see is that the number of places where a text, the meaning of a text could be affected in a significant way is really very small indeed. And actually, you know, no kind of central Christian claim, no central Christian doctrine rests on just one sort of sentence that could go either way in terms of the variations. So, and the New Testament scholar and textual critic Bart Ehrman, who some of you may have heard of, is famously sort of lost his faith, had a very conservative religious upbringing, but lost his faith when he was studying New Testament studies and you know, became an agnostic, perhaps atheist, and has written popular level books where he is quite critical of the Gospels. He has no doubt that Jesus was real and did various things, but he certainly makes a big thing about apparent, you know, contradictions between the Gospels. But Ehrman actually wrote a textbook with his mentor Bruce Metzger, who's some people say is one of the greatest manuscript scholars of the last 100 years. And Metzger was an evangelical and remains so. But Ehrman and Metzger wrote a textbook together in which, you know, they basically agree, this, you know, evangelical and this skeptic, they agree that we can basically know what the New Testament text says today. Yes, there are some variations, but they don't undermine our essential confidence that the text is essentially the same.